This army didn't just raid the coast and leave, they came to own it. And by the time winter finished its work, an entire kingdom had vanished from the map. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles called it the Great Heathen Army. But the survivors called it something else, the end of the world. And the proof lies beneath an English field, where bones still tell the story of what happened when the food ran out and the snow wouldn't stop falling. The year was 867. The place was Nottingham, and nothing would ever be the same. Most people think Vikings landed, grabbed gold, burned a monastery and sailed away. Quick hit-and-run raids, that's what the history books teach, that's what the movies show. But this time was different. This time they didn't leave. In 865, a force so massive it stunned the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms across the North Sea. Thousands of warriors, hundreds of ships, and they didn't come to steal, they came to stay. Over the next 14 years, they would tear apart 4 English kingdoms. They would starve cities into dust, they would rewrite history with blood and ice. This is the story of one siege, one winter, one kingdom that refused to kneel, and the starvation that broke them forever. If you love real, untold war stories that most channels oversimplify, this channel breaks them down scene by scene. We are unraveled archives, and this is the Siege of Nottingham. The army appeared out of a November fog, not 50 men, not 100, but an army so large that farmers dropped their tools and ran without looking back. The scouts brought the news to King Burgred of Mercia on horseback, their words tumbling out in panic. The Danes were coming. And this time, they weren't leaving. Let's understand who these people were. The Great Heathen Army wasn't a random collection of raiders. These were professionals, veterans from campaigns across Francia, men who had sacked Paris, men who had learned siege warfare on the rivers of Europe. And they were led by 3 brothers, sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Uber. Their names meant nothing to the Mercians yet, but they would, oh they would. The army landed first in East Anglia. King Edmund looked at the force and made a choice. He gave them horses, he gave them food, he gave them winter quarters. In return they promised peace. It was a lie. But it bought him time. The Vikings needed horses, not because they fought on horseback, they didn't. They needed to move fast, fought a strike before the warning fires could spread, to cover ground that would take a marching army weeks to cross. By the time King Burgred of Mercia heard the news, the Vikings were already moving north. Their target? York, the ancient capital of Northumbria. But York fell fast. Too fast. The Northumbrians had been fighting each other when the Vikings arrived. 2 kings fighting for the same throne. Ella and Osbert. They finally united when they saw the real enemy. But it was too late. The Vikings crushed them both. Ella died, according to legend, by the blood eagle. His ribs opened, his lungs pulled out, a sacrifice to Odin. Now only 2 kingdoms stood between the Great Heathen Army and all of England, Mercia and Wessex. And Mercia was next. King Burgred sat in his hall and listened to the reports. York was gone, but the Northumbrian kings were dead. The Viking army was now marching south toward his border, and he knew that his own army couldn't stop them alone. He needed help. He needed Wessex. But would they come? The year turned to 867. The Viking army left York and pushed south into Mercia. They didn't raid as they went. That was the strange part. They took food, they took supplies, but they didn't burn everything behind them. This was different. This was a conquest. They crossed the River Trent and kept moving. Their scouts rode ahead, marking the terrain. Their supply lines stretched back to the Humber, where ships waited with reinforcements. This wasn't a raid, this was an invasion. Slow, deliberate, deadly. Their target became clear: Nottingham. Not because it was the richest city, not because it was the largest, but because of what it represented. Nottingham sat on the border between Mercia and Wessex. Take Nottingham and you control the gateway. You cut Mercia in half. You make Wessex think twice about sending help. The Vikings arrived in late autumn. They didn't attack immediately. They built. Outside the city walls, they constructed a fortress. Not a temporary camp, a real fortress with earthworks and palisades, a place where they could survive the winter, a place where they could wait. Inside the city, King Burgred watched and waited. He saw the Viking flag rise over the earthworks. He saw the smoke from their cooking fires. He saw them digging in, settling down, getting comfortable. they weren't leaving. Burgred made his decision. He sent riders south, fast riders who would push their horses until they collapsed. And their message was simple: we cannot hold alone, come now or come too late. The riders disappeared into the November rain, and Burgred waited. Days passed, the Vikings didn't attack, they just sat there, watching, waiting, letting the fear build. Then one morning, a sentry shouted from the wall. Dust on the southern road, banners in the distance, red and gold. Wessex had answered. The West Saxons marched into Nottingham with their king at their head, King Ethelred, not yet 30 years old. His younger brother rode beside him, a boy named Alfred, the one they would later call Great. But that day they were just reinforcements, just another army walking into a trap, because the Vikings weren't hiding. They were waiting. The combined army was the largest force the Anglo-Saxons had assembled in years. Mercians and West Saxons fighting together, Burgred and Ethelred side by side, thousands of men packed inside the city walls. For a moment, it looked like victory, but then they looked outside the walls. The Viking fortress wasn't a camp anymore. It was a city of its own. Tents and huts and workshops, smiths making weapons, women weaving cloth, children running between the fires. The Great Heathen Army had brought their families. They had brought everything. They weren't going home. The Anglo-Saxon leaders held council in the Great Hall. Smoke rose from the central fire. Men argued. Some wanted to attack immediately, storm the fortress, crush them while they sleep. Others were more cautious. Look at those walls. Look at those warriors. These aren't farmers with axes. These are professionals. They've sacked Paris, they've killed kings. Our Alfred, just a boy really, listened and said nothing. They decided to wait, let the Vikings make the first move. Siege warfare was supposed to favour the defender. The Vikings would have to attack eventually. They would run out of food, they would get desperate, so they waited. Days passed, nothing happened. A week, nothing. 2 weeks. The Vikings didn't attack, they didn't send messengers, they didn't challenge anyone to single combat, they just sat in their fortress. And every morning more smoke rose from their cooking fires. Burgred started to worry. What were they eating? Where were they getting supplies? The river, the Trent. Viking ships were moving up and down, bringing food, bringing men, bringing everything they needed. The Anglo-Saxons had walked into a siege, but they were the ones inside the walls. But the first snow fell in early December. It wasn't deep, just dusting, but it changed everything. Because snow meant cold, cold meant sickness, sickness meant death. And the Vikings outside the walls, they had tents, they had fires, they had furs. Inside the city, the Anglo-Saxons had stone walls that held the cold like a tomb. Let's talk about winter in 9th century England. There were no weather forecasts, no heating systems, no warm clothing from factories. When winter came, you survived or you didn't. And this winter was brutal. Inside Nottingham, the food stores began to shrink, not because they were low, they had prepared for a siege, but because nobody knew how long this would last. The commanders rationed everything. Bread, ale, meat. Each man got a portion, just enough to stay alive, not enough to feel full. The soldiers huddled in buildings and cursed the cold. They burned wood they should have saved. They slaughtered animals they should have kept. And still the Vikings sat outside, patient as wolves. But here's the thing about Viking patience. It wasn't passive. Every few nights, small groups would approach the walls, not to attack, to test, to probe, to make sure the defenders never slept soundly. They'd shoot arrows over the walls, they'd shout insults in broken English, they'd bang shields and blow horns, then they'd disappear back into the darkness. The defenders couldn't rest, couldn't relax, couldn't ever feel safe, and the cold kept getting worse. By January, the food was running out, not completely, but noticeably. The bread got darker, the portions got smaller, men started looking at each other differently, not as comrades, as competition. And in the Great Hall, the kings stopped talking about victory. They started talking about survival. The rats went first. Not all of them, but enough. When soldiers start eating rats, you know things are bad. Then the horses, the war horses, the animals men had ridden for years. One by one, they disappeared into cooking pots. Burgred's own horse went in the 3rd week. He didn't complain. He understood. But something in his eyes changed that day. Something broke. The commanders met again. This time the arguments were different. No more talk of glorious charges, no more plans to crush the enemy. We need to negotiate. Negotiate? They're Vikings. They don't negotiate, they take. They took York, they took Northumbria. They'll take us if we stay here. We have Wessex with us. No, we have the strongest army in England. Do we? Look outside, they're still there, they're still fed, they're still warm. We're starving inside our own walls. Alfred spoke for the first time, quiet, careful. We can't break them by waiting. They have the river, they have supplies. We have nothing but hope. And hope isn't food. The hall fell silent. Ethelred looked at his younger brother. This boy, this child, speaking the truth that grown men were afraid to say. So what do you suggest? Alfred met his eyes. We fight or we leave, but we can't stay. The breakout attempt came on a frozen morning. No plan, no strategy, just desperation. Men were so hungry they didn't care anymore. Men who would rather die charging than starve sitting down. The gates opened, the war horns blew, and the Anglo-Saxon army ran straight at the Viking walls. It was chaos, no formation, no discipline, just thousands of men running across snow-covered ground, screaming, holding whatever weapons they could still lift. The Vikings watched them come. They lined the top of their earthworks, they notched their arrows, they waited. The first wave hit the palisade and died. Arrows from above, spears from the sides, swords from warriors who stepped forward to meet them. The second wave kept coming, over the bodies of the first. For a moment, it almost worked. A few Anglo-Saxons reached the top, a few Viking warriors fell, the line wavered, then the Viking reserves moved forward. Fresh men, well-fed men, men who hadn't spent months starving. They pushed the attackers back, over the wall, down the slope, across the snow. The Anglo-Saxons ran, not in retreat, in panic, back to the city gates, back to the only safety they knew. Burgred watched from the wall. He saw his army break. He saw men trampled by their own comrades. He saw the Vikings gathering the wounded and killing them where they lay. And he knew it was over. That night, no one slept. Not the Mercians, not the West Saxons, not the Vikings. Everyone knew something was about to change. The question was what, and who would live to tell about it? The Viking leaders sent a message under the flag of truce, not a threat, not a demand for surrender, just words. We don't want to destroy you. We want to live here. Give us what we want and you can leave. All of you, alive. Burgred read the message 3 times. He didn't believe it, but he had no choice. The negotiations took 3 days. The Vikings were generous. That was the strange part. They didn't ask for tribute, and they didn't ask for slaves. They just wanted Nottingham, the city, the walls, the position. The Anglo-Saxons could leave, take their weapons, take their wounded, march back to Wessex and Mercia with nothing but their lives. Burgred agreed. Ethelred agreed. The gates opened one last time. The combined army marched out. Thousands of men had arrived hoping for victory, now leaving with nothing but shame. The Vikings watched them go. No cheers, no insults, just silent satisfaction. They had won without a battle. They had starved a kingdom without lifting a sword. They had taken Nottingham without burning it, because a burned city is worthless. A captured city, that's wealth, that's power, that's home. The Anglo-Saxon army disappeared down the southern road. Behind them, smoke rose from Viking cooking fires. Ahead of them, nothing but winter and hunger and the long walk home. But for Mercia, the real nightmare was just beginning. Because Nottingham wasn't just a city, it was a door, and that door was now open. Mercia didn't fall immediately, but it was wounded, mortally. Without Nottingham, the kingdom couldn't defend its eastern border. Viking patrols moved freely through the countryside. Farmers abandoned their fields, villages emptied. The army that had marched to save the city now couldn't protect its own homes. Burgred ruled for a few more years, but he ruled a shadow. A kingdom that existed only because the Vikings hadn't bothered to take it yet. In 874, they finally did. Burgred fled to Rome. He never came back. The last king of an independent Mercia died in exile, far from the halls of his ancestors. The Vikings put their own man on the throne. As a puppet, a king who did what he was told, Mercia became a client state, not conquered, not destroyed, just absorbed, quietly, efficiently, without the glory of a final battle. That was the genius of the Great Heathen Army. They didn't need to kill everyone, they just needed to break the will to resist. And they had learned something at Nottingham, something they would use again and again. Patience wins, Starvation wins, winter wins. But one kingdom remained. Wessex, the land of Alfred. The boy who had watched his brother fail. The boy who had marched out of Nottingham with nothing but shame and hunger and the memory of defeat. And he never forgot. He never forgave. And he spent the rest of his life preparing for the day the Vikings would come for him. The Great Heathen Army didn't stop at Nottingham. They pushed south. They pushed west. They pushed into Wessex itself. In 871, they fought 9 battles against Alfred, now king after his brother's death. 9 battles in 1 year. Neither side could break the other. Alfred did something desperate. He paid them to leave. It wasn't surrender, it was a strategy. Buy time. Build strength. Wait for your moment. The Vikings took the silver and marched away. But they didn't go far. They took London. They took Mercia. They took everything except Wessex. For 5 years, Alfred prepared. He built forts. He trained soldiers. He organised his kingdom for total war. And in 878, the Vikings came again. This time, Alfred was ready. At the Battle of Edington, he broke them, crushed their army, captured their king, forced them to kneel and accept baptism. The Great Heathen Army scattered. And some settled in the lands they had conquered. Some went back to Ireland. Some disappeared into history. But Alfred didn't destroy them completely. He made a deal. The Danelaw. A treaty that gave the Vikings the north and east, and gave Alfred peace, and time, and a chance to build something new. So what did Nottingham mean? In the grand story of England, what was one siege in one winter in one city? Everything. It was the moment the Vikings proved they could win without fighting. The moment starvation became a weapon. The moment the Anglo-Saxons learned that walls don't protect you. Not when the enemy has time, not when winter is on their side. Think about what happened at Nottingham. No great battle, no heroic last stand, no songs sung in mead halls for generations, just cold, just hunger. It's just the slow realization that you can't win if you can't eat. The Vikings didn't need to be stronger, they didn't need to be faster, they just needed to be patient. And they were. God, they were. That patience changed England forever, because after Nottingham, every Anglo-Saxon king knew the truth. The Vikings weren't going away. They weren't going to get bored and leave. They were here to stay. And the only choices were adapt or die. Mercia adapted by becoming a puppet. Northumbria adapted by being conquered. Wessex adapted by fighting smarter, by learning from defeat, by becoming something new. That's why Alfred matters. Not because he won, but because he learned. He watched his brother fail at Nottingham. He starved with the army. He marched home in shame. And he never made the same mistakes again. Thus he built fortified towns, burghs, so every Englishman had a place of refuge. He created a standing army, part of it always ready, part of it farming, rotating so the kingdom was never defenceless. He built ships to fight Vikings at sea. He took the lesson of Nottingham and turned it into a shield. But the bones are still there, under the fields of Nottingham, under the parking lots and shopping centres and modern streets. Archaeologists have found them. Mass graves, men who died during that long winter, not in battle, just dead. From hunger, from the cold, from despair. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the siege in a few lines, barely a paragraph. No drama, no emotion, just facts. In this year, the army went from East Anglia to Northumbria and captured York. And in this year, they went from Mercia to Nottingham and wintered there. And King Burgred of Mercia and his council besought King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred to help them fight against the army. And they went with the West Saxon army into Mercia and came to Nottingham. And when they came to the fortress, they would not fight but made peace, and the army went back to York. That's it. That's all. Made peace. Such a small phrase for such a massive defeat. But the bones tell a different story. The bones say there was no peace. There was only survival. Only the choice between starving inside the walls or surrendering outside them. The bones say men died anyway. In the cold, in the dark, alone. And when the survivors marched out, they left those bones behind. Unburied, unmourned, just another cost of war. So what happened to the Great Heathen Army? They didn't disappear. They didn't go home. And they became English. They settled the lands they conquered. They married Anglo-Saxon women. They raised children who spoke both languages. They built farms and towns and traded with their former enemies. By the time Alfred died in 899, the Danelaw was a fact. Vikings ruled half of England, and English kings ruled the other half. But here's the twist. Those Vikings, they weren't Danish anymore. They were Anglo-Danish, Hiberno-Norse, something new, something that had never existed before. They became English. Slowly, over generations, the lines blurred. The children of warriors became farmers. The grandchildren of raiders became monks. The great-great-grandchildren of Ivar the Boneless became English nobles serving English kings. The conquest that was supposed to erase England created a new one. A hybrid. A mix of Anglo-Saxon and Viking. Of Christian and pagan. Of old and new. That's the part the sagas don't tell you. That's the part the movies leave out. The Vikings didn't destroy England. They rebuilt it in their own image, with their own blood, until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The siege of Nottingham should have been a footnote, a small defeat in a long war. But it was more than that. It was the moment the Vikings proved their strategy worked. The moment starvation became a weapon. The moment winter became an ally, and winter never forgot that lesson. Every siege after Nottingham used the same tactics. Cut off the food, wait for the cold, let hunger do the work. It worked at York, it worked at Reading, it worked in London, it worked wherever men had walls but not enough bread. The Great Heathen Army didn't conquer England with swords, and they conquered it with patience, with strategy, with the willingness to wait while their enemies starved. And when it was over, they didn't leave. They stayed. They became the thing they had tried to destroy. So the next time you walk through an English village with a name ending in by or Thorpe, those are Viking words. The next time you hear an English accent with rhythms that sound almost Scandinavian, that's the echo. The next time you bite into bread made from wheat that Viking farmers planted in English soil, that's their legacy. The siege that starved a kingdom didn't end that kingdom. It changed it forever. And somewhere under the streets of modern Nottingham, the bones are still waiting. Silent witnesses to the winter that broke a world and built a new one.